The night is a solid wall of black. The moon hides behind drifting clouds, and the air is cold enough to bite through leather. A German sentry stands in a frozen trench, listening, the kind of silence that makes the world feel dead. Then, faintly, a sound, a thin hum high above. Not the growl of a Messerschmitt or the thundering pulse of a bomber. This sound is softer, almost human, almost ghostly. He squints toward the stars. Nothing, just the whisper of wind through the steppe, and then a rush of air, a dull thump, a sudden blossom of flame erupts along the supply road. Panic spreads, men shout, scrambling for cover, the sound returns, the flutter of canvas wings, the echo of laughter swallowed by the dark. One pilot kills the engine, glides silently, releases her bomb, and vanishes into the night. The Germans have a name for them now, Nachthexen, the night witches. Their legend began in fear, but it was born from necessity, forged in the Soviet Union's desperate struggle to survive. And to understand their story, we must return to 1941, when the war first came east. At dawn on June 22, 1941, the German war machine crossed into the Soviet Union. 3 million Axis soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft advanced across a 1,800-mile front. Hitler's invasion, Operation Barbarossa, shattered the uneasy pact between Berlin and Moscow, launching the largest land invasion in history. The initial German assault was devastating. Within weeks, vast Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell in flames. Minsk, Smolensk, Kiev. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. By autumn, the Wehrmacht had reached the gates of Moscow itself. But behind the front lines, something remarkable began to stir. The Soviet Union, desperate and bleeding, called upon every citizen to defend the motherland. Not just men, but women too. In factories, hospitals, and farms, they took up roles abandoned by the men sent to the front. But some women wanted more. They wanted to fight. They wanted to fly. One woman made that possible. Marina Raskova, famed aviator, navigator on record-breaking long-distance flights in the 1930s. To the Soviet people, she was a national hero, the Soviet Amelia Earhart. When war broke out, Raskova petitioned Stalin directly to form women's aviation regiments, flown and commanded entirely by women. It was an extraordinary request in a world that still doubted women could handle combat aircraft. But Stalin approved. By late 1941, the Soviet Air Force began forming 3 all-female units, the 586th Fighter Regiment, the 587th Dive Bomber Regiment, and the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the one that would become legend. Their mission was simple, brutal, and near suicidal: fly low, under the cover of darkness, and bomb German positions night after night with outdated biplanes. Harass the enemy, disrupt their sleep, destroy their morale. When the order went out, hundreds of young women volunteered. They were students, teachers, athletes, some as young as 17. They arrived at the training base in Engels, near the Volga River, in winter uniforms that didn't fit, with flight goggles too large for their faces. But they carried something far heavier than equipment: the burden of proving themselves in a man's war. Skepticism was everywhere. Male officers mocked them. Mechanics doubted they could handle the cold, the weight of bombs, or the violence of combat. Their aircraft, the Polikarpov PO-2, was a relic, a wooden biplane, covered in canvas, designed for crop dusting and training. Its top speed barely reached 90 miles per hour. Against modern German fighters, it was suicide. But what the Po-2 lacked in speed, it made up for in silence. It could take off and land from a patch of dirt. It could glide soundlessly through the night. It could appear and vanish before the enemy even knew it was there. The women trained relentlessly, day and night, in freezing winds. They learned navigation by the stars, engine repair, and precision bombing. They learned to land without lights, to drop bombs at treetop level, to trust their instincts more than instruments. And in the spring of 1942, they received their orders. Destination: the Southern Front, the region around the Don and the Caucasus, where German forces were driving deep into Soviet territory. The 588th Regiment took flight for the first time, a formation of fragile biplanes piloted by young women, carrying the hopes of a desperate nation. Their war had begun. Snow swept across the frozen airfield like shards of glass. Engines groaned in the cold. Rows of young women stood beside their flimsy biplanes, clutching flight charts and wearing oversized men's uniforms. This was the first all-female combat regiment in world history, an experiment few believed would succeed. Their commander was Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a composed, steel-eyed officer chosen by Marina Raskova herself. Bershanskaya's job was not just to teach them how to fly, but how to survive. Training was relentless. Instructors barked orders from dawn till nightfall. The cadets learned to strip engines blindfolded, to patch bullet holes with linen, to navigate with only a compass and the stars. Each flight carried 2 women, a pilot and a navigator. No radio, no radar, only courage and instinct. They slept in barracks with frost creeping up the walls. They flew in temperatures that froze their hands to the controls. Fuel was rationed, bombs were few. They trained with sandbags when real munitions were scarce. And yet, something remarkable happened. Where others saw limits, they found rhythm. Their discipline grew sharper. Their trust in one another became absolute. If one plane went down, the others would search all night until it was found. Still, prejudice followed them everywhere. Male regiments sneered as they passed. They called them the girls, the skirt squadron, or worse. But once the women began flying combat missions, the tone changed. Their first assignment came in the summer of 1942 near the Southern Front. German forces were advancing toward the oil-rich Caucasus. Soviet cities burned. The 588th was deployed to harass enemy encampments and supply lines at night. Missions no one else wanted. They flew the Polikarpov PO-2, one of the simplest aircraft ever built. Made of plywood and canvas, its open cockpit left pilots exposed to freezing air and enemy fire. But its simplicity became its weapon. When German searchlights swept the skies, the women would cut their engines and glide silently toward the target. The only sound was the soft hiss of wind over the wings. Then, a flash, a small thud, and chaos below. By the time the Germans looked up, the planes were gone. Each aircraft could carry only 2 bombs per sortie, but they flew multiple missions a night, returning again and again, rearming in darkness. Sometimes they flew 10 times before dawn. Their biplanes were so light that even a tracer bullet could set them ablaze, yet they kept coming. The Germans, bewildered and humiliated by being harassed by witches, coined the term Nachthexen, night witches. They claimed the women had cat-like eyes and could see in the dark. They swore the Soviets gave them special injections to improve night vision. But there was no magic, only discipline, only bravery. Only the relentless sound of wings that refused to die. By autumn of 1942, the Night Witches had flown hundreds of missions. They struck ammunition dumps, fuel depots, and rear supply lines. They slept little, ate what they could, and painted their lips red before takeoff. Not vanity, but defiance. When Marina Raskova was killed in a crash early the next year, the regiment mourned like daughters. Her dream, a place for women in combat, had become their reality. And with every flight into the blackness, they carved their names deeper into history. They were barely adults, most between 19 and 23. Some had never seen a battlefield before. They arrived at the front carrying their own parachutes, maps, and nervous laughter. They slept in makeshift tents dug into frozen soil, their uniforms still too big, their boots often stuffed with rags. Yet, beneath the exhaustion and fear, there was pride. Each of them understood what they represented. A living contradiction to everything the world believed about women and war. There was Nadezhda Popova, whose brother had been killed by the Germans. She once returned from a sortie with her plane riddled with 42 bullet holes, and went back up the next night. There was Yevgenia Rudneva, navigator and astronomer, who named her bombs after lost friends. And Irina Sibrova, who flew over 1,000 missions, gliding through black skies with steady hands and a calm voice. They became sisters, bound not by birth, but by fear, courage, and shared survival. Before every flight, they hugged silently, knowing that any of them might not return. Each plane had 2 women. If one fell, the other would likely go with her. The nights were merciless. Frost formed on their eyelashes. Their hands bled through thin gloves. Engines coughed in the cold. Instruments froze. and navigation lights were forbidden. A single spark could betray them, but they flew anyway, because every flight mattered. Every bomb dropped meant one less German tank, one less ammunition dump, one more day of resistance. They found ways to keep hope alive. They sang songs quietly during refueling. They wrote letters in pencil, folded in jacket pockets before takeoff. "If I don't come back, tell my mother I flew well." They painted their lips before night raids, calling it combat makeup. For them, beauty became rebellion, proof that war would not steal their womanhood. Over time, fear turned to rhythm. They learned to sense danger by the pulse of the engine, the pitch of the wind. They began to anticipate German defenses, where searchlights might sweep, when flak would open. They flew in pairs and trios, covering one another, feinting attacks to draw fire away from friends. What began as a mission of survival evolved into a ritual of defiance. Each sortie was a statement. We are here. We will not vanish. 2. The tactical angle. The Night Witches were not built for brute force. They were built for precision, stealth, and psychological impact. Their tactics were as unconventional as their existence. Each PO2 carried two 50-kilogram bombs under its wings, light but deadly if placed right. They flew in groups of 3. 2 aircraft would approach first, drawing the attention of searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The third, flying in silence with its engine cut, would glide unseen, drop its bombs, and disappear into darkness. Then, the rotation began again. By the time German crews adjusted, the Night Witches were already gone, or back for another round. They struck fuel dumps, encampments, bridges, and supply depots. They didn't destroy divisions, they dismantled morale. German troops began to dread the night. They learned that silence did not mean safety, that the faint whoosh above their heads might precede sudden fire. Exhaustion set in. Soldiers started to say that anyone who shot down a Night Witch automatically earned an Iron Cross. Few ever did. The PO2's maximum speed was slower than a German fighter's stall speed. That meant enemy planes literally struggled to engage them, overshooting their targets. Flak guns were equally frustrated. The low altitude and slow movement made them hard to predict. What was once considered a weakness, simplicity, became their greatest strength. A PO2 could take off from a meadow, repair in minutes, and fly again. It required almost no maintenance compared to heavy bombers, and when damaged, they patched holes with fabric, wire, or sometimes tape. Each night, the airfields of the 588th came alive like small constellations of motion. Mechanics loaded bombs under starlight. Pilots checked maps by flashlight. Engines sputtered, wings trembled, and one by one, the biplanes rose into the dark, like ghosts lifting from the earth. Between missions, there was no glory, just exhaustion. They landed, refueled, and went again. Sometimes with frostbitten hands, sometimes half-conscious from lack of sleep. One pilot later wrote, "We had no time to be afraid. The sky belonged to us, and we belonged to the sky." It was a strange kind of warfare. Not one of decisive victories, but of constant pressure. The Night Witches were the whisper that never stopped, the shadow that robbed the enemy of rest. They were not meant to destroy armies. They were meant to unnerve them, night after night, until the fear itself did the work. As their sorties increased, so did their legend. To the Germans, they were supernatural. To the Soviets, they were a symbol of defiance. To history, they were the embodiment of quiet power, proving that the smallest machine, in the right hands, could haunt an empire. At first glance, the Polikarpov PO2 seemed laughably obsolete. It was a relic from the 1920s, a trainer, not a combat aircraft. Wooden frame, canvas skin, a small Shvetsov M11 engine producing barely 100 horsepower. Its top speed, 90 miles per hour, slower than most cars on the Autobahn. And yet, in the hands of the 588th Regiment, it became a weapon of extraordinary psychological warfare. The PO2's lightweight design gave it unique advantages. It could take off and land on rough fields, even muddy roads. It could fly at treetop level, almost invisible to radar. Its open cockpit gave pilots unmatched visibility, crucial during night missions. But the most haunting feature was its silence. When the women cut their engines before dropping bombs, the PO2 glided like a shadow through the air. The faint whoosh of wind across fabric became the last sound German soldiers ever heard before the explosions. The Germans called it der Nähmaschine, the sewing machine, for the rhythmic sound of its sputtering engine, but the name Nachthexen, night witches, captured their fear far better. The aircraft's simplicity also made it nearly indestructible to mechanical failure. Even if it was hit by small arms fire, the slow speed and wooden frame often allowed it to limp home. The women patched bullet holes with plywood and linen, often within hours, ready to fly again. And there was another advantage: logistics. Each PO2 consumed minimal fuel, meaning the regiment could sustain nightly operations, even when supplies ran low. While larger bombers needed runways and maintenance crews, the Night Witches needed little more than a field and moonlight. To the Germans, this was maddening. To the Soviets, it was ingenious. It proved that technological superiority was not always the path to dominance. Adaptability was. 4. The enemy angle. For the German army, the war on the Eastern Front was already brutal, but the arrival of the Night Witches added a new kind of torment, one that struck not the body, but the mind. They came without warning. No engines, no formation lights, just the faint flap of wings, the drop of bombs, and then nothing. By dawn, the soldiers were left shaken, sleepless, and jumpy. Reports from German units described persistent nocturnal harassment and severe strain among troops due to constant bombing. Psychological fatigue became a weapon. Every night, searchlights crisscrossed the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries fired wildly into darkness, and men waited, hearts pounding, for a sound that might never come. Sometimes the witches didn't even drop bombs. Their mere presence overhead was enough to keep the enemy awake. The Germans soon developed superstitions. They said the Night Witches could see in total darkness, that their planes were made from special Soviet materials, invisible to radar. Some swore they turned into birds at dawn. For the Luftwaffe, it was humiliation. To be harassed by women flying slow biplanes was unthinkable. Commanders offered rewards to anyone who could shoot one down, even the prestigious Iron Cross, but it rarely happened. German fighters often overshot the Po-2s, unable to stay airborne at such low speeds without stalling. The Night Witches turned every weakness of their aircraft into a tactical edge, and every night of survival into a victory of morale. 5. The leadership angle. Behind their success stood a structure of quiet, disciplined leadership, and a legacy of belief. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, their commander, was not the loudest or most flamboyant officer, but she was respected. She created a culture of order and trust, strict but maternal. She refused to allow despair or arrogance. Every pilot, every navigator mattered. Every mechanic's hands were as vital as a general's orders. Under her command, the regiment became a model of efficiency. Missions were meticulously planned. Each sortie's timing, route, and altitude were calculated by hand. Errors were analyzed, not punished. Bershanskaya knew that these women were not just soldiers, they were symbols. Their success would change how the world viewed women in war. Above her loomed the spirit of Marina Raskova, the aviator whose dream had made the regiment possible. Even in death, her influence lingered. Her name was invoked before missions, her courage remembered during moments of fear. She had given them permission to break boundaries, and Bershanskaya gave them the discipline to survive beyond them. The Night Witches also developed their own informal leaders. Women like Nadezhda Popova, who led countless raids mentoring younger pilots, or Yevgenia Rudneva, who inspired others with her intellect and unshakable calm. Leadership flowed horizontally, not through rank, but through respect. It was this unity, forged in shared struggle, that gave them endurance. They weren't just following orders. They were fighting for a cause larger than themselves, to prove that courage has no gender. By 1943, that cause had become unstoppable. The Night Witches were no longer dismissed as an experiment. They were veterans, feared by the enemy, honored by their comrades, and relentless in the skies. But their legend would truly ignite in the years that followed, when they faced their most dangerous missions yet. The ground still trembled from winter's thaw. The air smelled of oil, salt, and smoke. Here, between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, the German army had fortified a critical position, the Taman bridgehead. It was the gateway to the Caucasus, a region rich in oil fields that Hitler desperately needed to fuel his war. The Red Army wanted it back, and for that, they needed the skies, or rather, the night. By now, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had become a ghostly presence across the front. They were no longer novices, they were veterans, lean, hard, and mercilessly efficient. Their aircraft carried names painted in white along the fuselage: Revenge, the Avenger, Fearless Nadia. Each mission was a blend of precision and madness, hundreds of sorties launched under starlight, each one flirting with death. In May 1943, the Night Witches were tasked with a new objective: neutralize German defenses along the Taman Peninsula to prepare for a Soviet ground offensive. Night after night, they flew from makeshift airstrips near the Kuban River, grass runways, no lights, no radar. They relied on memory, on the rhythm of their route, the faint glimmer of rivers, the orange flashes of artillery. They flew in pairs. The first plane drew fire, the second slipped through the dark. Sometimes, they flew so low that waves licked the underside of their wings. German flak gunners were waiting for them. Searchlights swept across the sky like prison beams. Every flight became a duel between invisibility and death. To counter this, the women developed a new maneuver. They called it the cut and glide. Moments before the bombing run, they shut off their engines completely. The Po-2 descended in eerie silence, gliding like a phantom toward the target. When the bombs dropped, the explosion lit up the night, and for a few seconds, their silhouettes flashed in the firelight. By the time German guns responded, the women were already gone, engines sputtering back to life as they vanished into the clouds. Those few seconds, between light and darkness, were their most vulnerable and their most courageous. The raids on Taman became relentless. The regiment flew up to 15 sorties per night per crew. Sometimes they slept only an hour or two between missions. Mechanics rearmed planes with frozen fingers. Navigators plotted routes with trembling hands under the glow of cigarette embers. The roar of engines became a lullaby of exhaustion. The Germans never adjusted. Every night, their camps erupted in chaos. Men shouting, flares bursting, trucks scattering. Even when the Night Witches didn't attack, soldiers imagined they did. The constant fear fractured discipline, drained morale, and turned darkness itself into an enemy. It wasn't just harassment, it was warfare of the mind. In one of those missions, Lieutenant Nadezhda Popova and her navigator, Yekaterina Ryabova, flew through a storm of flak. Tracer fire sliced the sky like lightning. They were hit multiple times, their wings shredded, fuel leaking. Still, they pressed on. They reached the target, dropped their bombs, and limped back through clouds of smoke. When they landed, their aircraft had more than 40 holes, the fabric torn, the frame cracked, but they were alive. Popova reportedly smiled, brushed soot from her cheek, and whispered, "We'll go again tonight." That sentence captured the essence of the Night Witches. It was not bravado, it was duty. They didn't fly for glory or medals. They flew because the front demanded it. By July 1943, the regiment's impact was undeniable. The Soviet command credited them with hundreds of successful raids over Taman alone. They destroyed ammunition dumps, supply depots, and key transport routes that crippled German logistics. As the Red Army advanced, the Night Witches followed, always close to the front, always under fire. Their airfields were often bombed during the day. When the sirens wailed, the women didn't run for cover. They ran to their planes, pushing them into trenches or under camouflage nets. They had learned that their safety depended not on hiding, but on readiness. The Taman campaign lasted through summer into autumn. When it ended, Soviet forces reclaimed the peninsula. The Night Witches had flown more than 2,000 sorties during the operation. For their endurance and precision, the regiment was honored with the Order of the Red Banner. From that moment, they were no longer officially the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They became the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, an elite title reserved for units that showed extraordinary valor. They had begun as a dismissed experiment. Now they were a legend. But victory carried a cost. Many did not return. Planes vanished into forests, mountains, and seas. When a crew failed to return, the others searched all night, not because it was ordered, but because they couldn't bear to stop listening for the hum of their sisters' wings. Still, the war was far from over. Ahead lay the bloodiest year yet, 1944, when the Night Witches would push across the front lines into newly liberated territories, striking deeper and farther than ever before. The tide of war had turned. After the victory at Stalingrad and the grinding battles across the Kuban and Taman, the Soviet army was now on the offensive. But the push toward Crimea, the heavily fortified peninsula guarded by entrenched German divisions, would demand endurance, coordination, and above all, darkness. And the darkness belonged to the Night Witches. Their new title, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, carried prestige, but also pressure. The Soviets now viewed them not as an experiment, but as a weapon. Their success was expected, their performance monitored. They were now part of the Soviet spearhead, moving westward with the Red Army's unstoppable momentum. Their bases shifted constantly. They packed and relocated airfields in hours, setting up in open meadows, icy beaches, or abandoned farm fields. There were no runways, no hangars, no safety. Only the constant rhythm of preparation, flight, and survival. Every night, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the regiment stirred like a living organism. Navigators marked maps with trembling pencils. Mechanics loaded bombs by hand, their faces blackened with soot. Engines coughed to life. One by one, the air filled with the low murmur of courage. Then, takeoff. Wings lifting against moonlight, 100 whispers rising into the dark. In Crimea, the Night Witches faced perhaps their most difficult missions. The terrain was treacherous, steep cliffs, sudden storms, and German flak batteries stationed on high ground. Visibility was often zero. The smallest navigation error could send a plane into the sea, and yet they flew. One night, Lieutenant Yevgenia Rudneva, the brilliant navigator and astronomy student from Moscow University, was assigned a dangerous sortie near Sevastopol. Her aircraft never returned. The regiment searched for days. They found only fragments of her PO-2 in a ravine. Her death struck the regiment deeply. Rudneva had been a symbol of intellect, calm, and purpose. She had once written to her mother, "I will be useful, and if I die, I want you to know that I died for something that mattered." Her words became a quiet prayer whispered by others before takeoff. By mid-1944, as the Red Army liberated Crimea and pressed into Eastern Europe, the Night Witches were flying up to 18 missions a night. Their faces were pale from exhaustion, their uniforms soaked with oil and smoke, but their morale never cracked. They no longer flinched at flak bursts. They no longer counted missions, only results. Every success added to their growing legend. German intelligence reports warned of elite Soviet female bomber units capable of sustained nocturnal attack. But for the women themselves, fame meant little. They measured success in survival. They measured victory in the silence after the bombs fell. That single heartbeat when they knew the mission had struck true. Their courage drew admiration from allies and enemies alike. Captured German officers reportedly expressed disbelief when shown photographs of their tormentors, young women smiling beside fragile planes. One prisoner muttered, "We thought they were men. No man could fly that many times in a night." The irony was bitter. These women had been denied equality and peace, yet in war they earned it through terror. But heroism carried weight. Fatigue became its own enemy. Some pilots flew through fevers, some fell asleep mid-flight. There were moments when frostbite made it impossible to feel the controls, and still, they went on. When the war reached Belarusia, the Night Witches moved north to support Operation Bagration, one of the largest Soviet offensives of the war. Here, in the forests and marshes, their tactics reached near perfection. They bombed supply convoys, trains, and field depots so relentlessly that German columns began moving only during daylight hours to avoid them. The night, once their ally, had become the enemy's prison. In late 1944, tragedy struck again. Yevdokia Nosal, one of the regiment's most skilled pilots, was killed by shrapnel while returning from a raid. Her navigator managed to land the burning plane, but Nosal died in the cockpit. She was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. By war's end, 23 women of the 46th Guards Regiment would receive that same honor. the highest in the USSR. 30 more were decorated with the Order of the Red Banner. Their achievements were unmatched. They had flown over 23,000 sorties, dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs, destroyed hundreds of enemy positions, bridges, and trains. They were the most highly decorated female unit in Soviet history. As 1945 approached, the Night Witches pushed farther west, following the Red Army into Poland and Germany. Their missions became longer, colder, lonelier, but they did not stop, even when the front collapsed around Berlin, even when victory was near. They flew until the last enemy position was silent, and when the war ended, the skies finally stilled. The wind no longer smelled of smoke. The Po-2s rested on silent fields, wings scarred by years of fire. The women stepped down from their cockpits, exhausted, hollow, but alive. For the first time in years, they could sleep without listening for engines. For the first time, the night was just the night. May 1945, Germany. The war in Europe was over. The guns fell silent across the scarred continent. Cities lay in ruin, rivers choked with debris, fields pocked with craters. And through that silence, the faint hum of old engines echoed one last time. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, the Night Witches, had flown their final sortie. For 3 relentless years, they had lived by the rhythm of war. Fly, strike, return, repeat. Now, there was only stillness. Their final orders were simple: stand down. Their duty was done. But for the women who had lived by the heartbeat of flight, peace felt almost alien. They lined up their battered Polikarpov Po-2s on an abandoned German airfield, their wooden wings chipped and patched, the canvas darkened by oil and smoke. Each plane bore scars, shrapnel holes, bullet punctures, soot-streaked noses. Each one told a story. The regiment gathered for a final ceremony. Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya stood before them, calm as ever, though her eyes betrayed exhaustion. In her speech she thanked them not as soldiers, but as daughters of a nation reborn from fire. Many wept quietly. Some saluted through trembling hands. When the Soviet flag was raised above the airstrip, it wasn't triumph they felt. It was something quieter: relief, disbelief, and a kind of grief that words couldn't express. They had survived when so many had not. The statistics were staggering. In total, the regiment had flown over 23,000 combat missions, more than any other female aviation unit in history. They had dropped more than 3,000 tons of bombs, destroyed hundreds of ammunition dumps, bridges, and fortifications. They had lost 32 crew members. Every one of them was buried with full military honors. For their valor, 23 women were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest decoration. Dozens more received the Order of the Red Banner, Order of the Patriotic War, and other honors. Even the enemy, in their reports, acknowledged their effectiveness. Captured German documents referred to the regiment as an ever-present nocturnal threat, impossible to intercept. That was their epitaph in enemy ink. When the women returned home, they were greeted with cheers, flowers, and parades. But after the celebration faded, something unexpected followed: silence. Peace had no place for legends. Many of the Night Witches found that their wartime heroism did not translate to civilian life. Their regiments were disbanded. Their aircraft were scrapped or left to rot in fields. Some women tried to continue flying, but most were told bluntly, "The war is over, go home." And so they did. To villages, to schools, to lives that felt smaller than the skies they had conquered. They became teachers, engineers, mothers. Some carried invisible wounds, the loss of friends, the echo of flak bursts, the memory of endless darkness. The Soviet Union, consumed by rebuilding, slowly forgot its witches of the night. Their story slipped into footnotes, their faces faded from photographs. Only among veterans, the pilots and soldiers who had once seen their faint shadows cross the moon, did the legend remain alive. Yet time has a way of uncovering forgotten courage. As decades passed, historians and journalists began to rediscover the Night Witches. Surviving members shared their stories, humble, understated, factual. They never spoke of glory, only of duty, of fear, and of the bond between those who flew when others would not. As the Soviet Union moved into the age of nuclear missiles and supersonic jets, The old wooden biplanes of the 588th Regiment seemed like relics from another world. Their story faded beneath the shadow of new wars, new weapons, and new heroes. The night witches, who had flown through fire and fear, returned quietly to ordinary lives. Most never spoke of their service. They worked as engineers, doctors, school teachers, even clerks. A few married fellow veterans, others lived alone. When asked about the war, many simply said, "We did what we had to do." There was no bitterness in their tone, only humility. To them, heroism was not an act of glory. It was survival. Their medals were kept in drawers, their flight logs tucked in boxes. But the memories never vanished. Each anniversary of Victory Day they gathered, gray-haired now, walking slower, but with the same quiet dignity. They still referred to one another by rank, still used call signs from their flying days. The laughter returned easily, as did the silence when they remembered the ones who had not come home. It was not until the 1970s that the world began to rediscover them. Western historians, intrigued by the Soviet war effort, stumbled across references to female night bomber regiments. Journalists tracked down surviving pilots, expecting tales of propaganda. What they found instead was truth, simple, unembellished, and astonishing. When the first documentaries aired in the 1980s, audiences were captivated. The contrast was striking. Young women in leather jackets and wool caps, flying fragile biplanes through firestorms. It felt almost mythical, and yet every part of it was real. The term night witches spread beyond military archives into popular memory. It appeared in books, films, and classrooms. For the first time, the world learned the names of Nadezhda Popova, Yevdokia Bershanskaya, Yevgenia Rudneva, and so many others. The women who had once terrified the German army became symbols of endurance, equality, and defiance. Popova, one of the regiment's best-known pilots, lived to see her story told in countless interviews. She often smiled when asked about the nickname Night Witch. "They called us witches," she once said, "because we made them fear the night, but we were just girls who wanted to fly." In the Soviet Union, official recognition returned gradually. During the 1980s and 1990s, surviving members received belated honors, public tributes, and invitations to speak at schools and academies. Monuments were erected in Russia and Ukraine, small stone markers, sometimes beside airfields long reclaimed by grass. On them were engraved words like, "To the daughters of the sky, they feared nothing but silence." But time was relentless. By the early 2000s, only a handful of night witches remained alive. Their voices grew fainter, but their legend grew louder. Every retelling rekindled the awe that once gripped German soldiers on dark nights, that feeling of hearing a whisper above and realizing too late what it meant. The night witch's story transcended war. It became a symbol of something larger. That courage is not confined to strength. That silence can be more powerful than thunder. And that even in the darkest nights, humanity's will to resist can burn brighter than any flame. They had proven that in 1942, when the world said women couldn't fight, couldn't fly, couldn't matter in a man's war. And they rose into the sky to prove it wrong. Today their story is taught in academies across the world, not just as a tale of heroism, but as a lesson in innovation and perseverance. The Poe, too, once dismissed as obsolete, now rests in museums, its wooden wings polished and revered. Visitors stand before it and imagine what it must have felt like. The cold, the wind, the fear, and the silence before the dive. When the last of the night witches passed away, her coffin was draped not in silk or metals, but in the same coarse fabric once stretched across her plane's wings. It was fitting, simple, enduring, unbreakable. Because their legend was never built on glory. It was built on flight, on the courage to rise again, night after night, when the world said they couldn't. The skies they once haunted are quiet now, but every whisper of wind across an open field still seems to echo their name, the night witches, the women who made fear itself take flight.